Well, hello and a very big welcome to the Emmanuel Leaders Gathering. Thank you so much for joining us for what I trust will be a fantastic occasion. We've really enjoyed these interviews that we've done over recent months, and I want to introduce you to a very good friend who I know is going to bring a lot of help and wisdom to us. When Jesus sent his disciples out into the watching world to represent him, he told them to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. He also told them to remember that he was sending them as sheep among wolves. So they have a kind of a interesting assortment of animals to which they should compare themselves. But I hope you get the idea that there's an interesting combination of traits he expects from them. Wise as serpents, gentle as doves. We need to be smart. We need to understand the world into which we've been sent. We need to have some grasp of the ideas, the undercurrents, the kind of philosophies and worldviews that the world around us has given itself to. We also need to be smart about who Jesus is and the message he's called us to proclaim and how to represent him accurately. But we need to do it with gentleness. We need to do it with kindness. We need to do it harmlessly, not seeking to win arguments and debates, but seeking to bless people's lives with the goodness of Jesus Christ himself. Jesus showed us that in his own model, being filled with grace and truth. The person I want to introduce you to today is, in my opinion, a very good example of this combination. Sam Allberry, who's from the UK, currently lives in the States, but spent many years as a pastor, not far from here in the south of England, and then began a career as a writer. He's written a number of very significant books dealing with important and sometimes very difficult issues in a sensitive, kind, and truth-filled, honest way. His probably most well-known book at the moment is the book, Is God Anti-Gay?, which as a title speaks for itself. You may have come across it. There's also a number of superb books dealing with church life, singleness, and presenting a lot of important arguments, persuasions to help people to see the merit and the truth and the trustworthiness of the person of Jesus and the message of the Bible. That, in fact, has been a large part of his career in recent years. He's traveled very widely and involved himself in what we call apologetics. In other words, seeking to present the message of Jesus persuasively to people who may have questions and objections, so that they can get a good understanding of the kind of answers and clear defenses that there are to be found, compelling us to put our faith confidently in Jesus. Faith isn't meant to be a blind thing. It's meant to be something that we become persuaded of because we are aware of the good arguments that are presented. Sam has done that for many years, very skillfully and very graciously. So let me introduce you to the man himself and the interview that we are doing with him. Sam, it is a real privilege to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to ask you a whole load of questions on a variety of things, but it would be good for people to know a little bit of your story, perhaps to start us off. Do you mind telling us a bit about your background and perhaps especially your conversion, how you came to know Jesus yourself?
Yeah, I didn't grow up going to church or anything like that. We didn't there was no discussion of Christianity through my whole childhood. And as a teenager, I went back and forth over whether or not I thought there was a God, depending on what side of bed I got out of. But when I was 17, I started working at a local independent coffee shop, and it was owned by a Christian family, and quite a few of the staff were Christian. And they were the first Christian believers I really got to know up close. They were my age, they were really good friends, and they were different to typical 17-year-olds. There was an integrity to them, there was a care to them. I knew I could trust them, and had a sort of rocky ride at secondary school, and so trustworthiness had high currency for me. And they, after I finished A-levels, they said, "Do you want to come to our church's youth group?" And I kind of thought, yeah, I'll find out what it is you guys are into, what makes you tick. I felt I owed it to them as a friend to find out a little bit more about what they believed. And the very first time I went, someone presented the gospel, and I realized immediately that what I had imagined Christianity to be was totally different to what I was hearing. And that it wasn't about God congratulating good people. It was about Jesus coming to find lost people. And I had this sudden conviction that if there was indeed a God who had made me, I don't know him. And I figured that was probably on me. And therefore that actually I probably am one of those lost people Jesus has come looking for. And so very quickly came to believe the gospel. And the week of my 18th birthday, I remember thinking, if Jesus has done all this for me, if he's died for me and risen again for me, I can trust my life to him. And I remember thinking, from now on, I'm going to follow Jesus. And I knew that I didn't know what that would look like or entail, but I knew I could trust him. And so I thought, whatever this ends up looking like, it's going to be okay because it's Jesus. So that was more years ago than I care to remember now.
You look a couple of years older than 18. So I'm not going to say how many, but how's it been since then?
Yeah, it's been, do you know what? It's obviously there's ups and downs in the Christian life. I'm 25 years later, I think, something like that. I still don't feel like I'm very good at being a Christian, but I love following Jesus.
Right.
I love looking to him. I love his word. It often wounds me. It can often frustrate me, but he's more and more, I realize he's even more good than I had thought he was.
Yes.
And that's just what makes you accelerate towards him more than anything else. It's not arguments for his existence. It's just taste and see that the Lord is good, and the flavor just keeps getting better and better. So yeah, I've been very faithless and he's been very faithful in it all.
I think the way you put it is fascinating, given that your work has increasingly been to do with presenting Jesus in a very secular world. You've been involved in apologetics, which, for those watching who are new to some of the language, basically means presenting or explaining, even defending the message of Christianity, persuading people about its trustworthiness. And I'd be fascinated to know how that's developed, perhaps, for you, the kind of questions, objections that you find the secular world is throwing at you. I know you're based currently in the States, but there'll be all kinds of similarities culturally in the city you live in now and the one I'm speaking from in Brighton. Yeah. Tell us a bit about the kind of things you're coming across, questions, objections.
Yeah, and it's I'm not an academically minded person, so it's not that I read thousands of books a week about 30,000-foot cultural developments, but I was converted late enough in my life that I can still remember what it feels like to be an unbelieving adult. And most of the people I'm closest to in this world are not kind of committed churchgoers, or would say that they're committed followers of Jesus. And so anytime I'm in church myself, I'm hearing, there's always a bit of my brain that is thinking, how would they hear this? How would this land on them? How would this have landed on the 17-year-old me? And so I can't switch off that sensibility. Times I wish I could. So I'm always thinking, how's this going to land on other people? So I got into apologetics, I guess, through ground level conversations with sometimes with relatives, sometimes with friends. I became a Christian, went off to university, did a very secular course on comparative religion and theology, and
it must have been really
immediately. It was a foolish decision that the Lord really used.
Yes,
because I didn't know anything. Yeah. And I thought theology would be Bible study. Realized I was one of the only Bible-believing Christians in the whole class, I think me and one or two others, and therefore had to learn very quickly, okay, oh my goodness, there's all these arguments why I shouldn't believe the Bible and why the church is terrible. I've got to think this stuff through. And I lived a 35-minute walk from campus, would have to go to campus probably twice a day. I would use those walks to try and anticipate, okay, what's going to come up today and what might I be able to say in response to it? And that's been great training for me. I still do that. And so today we've gone through some significant cultural changes in the last 10 years on a number of fronts, and just hearing what people are saying, how people are thinking. Again, I'm always thinking, well, if Christianity is true, there'll be a compelling response to that, and I just need to try and find it.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how people think and how to connect where people are at today with this Jesus who is so compelling and so beautiful, and to try and, we can never do him justice. But you have just the best time failing to do him justice. It's well worth trying. So yeah, and I think in terms of what I'm hearing these days is, again, what we're all hearing on social media, on TV, all over the place, is that increasingly Christianity isn't obscure and old-fashioned and dusty, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous to people's psychological well-being, especially LGBTQ plus people and other kind of minority groups. So that's changed. I think 15, 20 years ago, someone might have said, I don't like Christianity because you're too ethical for me.
Right.
And now today it would be, I don't like Christianity because you're too unethical.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a new cultural space, I think, for many of us to have to inhabit and learn to live with and respond to.
Yes. How do you advise us, Sam? I think you're touching on something so important there, and I think you'll have. I know you say you're not an academic. I know that you'll have gained a lot of wisdom through study, but also through experience and ministry. The way that we need to conduct ourselves in the context we find ourselves. So here in Brighton, I know we as friends here in the church, we genuinely will be wanting to love the people of our city and to represent Jesus well. We find, I suppose, temptations on both sides, either to kind of over assimilate to the point where we basically are almost indistinguishable in our values and ideas and sentiments and behavior even from the people around us who don't follow Jesus at all. But there's also the opposite danger of simply disengaging completely, because it might feel a little safer and just living in a place of kind of hermetically sealed opposition to the culture. And I know there's a lot of comments that people make about how to find that sweet spot, but I imagine that you've had to learn a lot yourself about this. How would you encourage us?
Yeah, there's some key verses that have been kind of particularly significant for me. One is, and I'm going to probably misquote all of them. So this is the Sam Allberry misremembered version, but it
sounds like a reliable translation. So.
Yeah, it's great. 1 Peter 2, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, they may glorify God on the day he visits us. Something
I think you got it precisely right, actually. I was in that verse just last week, and you probably got it right. So be encouraged.
And I'm struck there, Peter says, he doesn't say live good lives among the Christians.
Right.
So we must be living among those who are not believers, and pagan is not intended to sound as a kind of pejorative. So we can't remove ourselves from culture and kind of, well, let's just seal ourselves up in a kind of Christian bubble somewhere. But similarly, he doesn't say live pagan lives among the pagans. We've got to live good lives among the pagans. And if one danger is that we withdraw, another danger is that we're present but just constantly cranky. And I see this a lot more in the States, I think, than in the UK, but where there has been a loss of whatever cultural privilege had still remained in being a Christian, it's very easy for some Christians to start to resent that. And we can look at culture in many respects going further and further away from Christianity and even kind of against it. And it's very easy for us to get defensive and angry and resentful of that. And it's not as if Peter was living in a really culturally sympathetic kind of non-Christian climate, but he says, live good lives. And so that's a key challenge. And the other one I keep coming back to is in Mark 6, when Jesus is just kind of surrounded by these crowds. We're told that he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so when we see the lostness of the lost, which we do in so many, tragic ways, again, we shouldn't be scolding them and feeling superior or getting angry. We should be having compassion. And the very thing it says Jesus does next is, therefore, he began to teach them many things. And so as we see such cultural confusion around us, it should awaken Christ-like compassion that then drives us into teaching many things about Jesus. And that's the most loving thing we can do in a lost world, is to introduce people to the teaching of Jesus. So I'm not trying to fight a culture war. I know that language gets thrown around a lot. There are times when you want to stand up for truth and for human dignity, and particularly for the vulnerable. I think that's more honourable than standing up for some Christian slice of the pie and trying to defend that. But those are two passages I keep coming back to at the moment. So I can't ignore culture and just hang out with the Christians. But similarly, I've got to be a presence within culture that mediates the goodness of Jesus Christ and seeks to bring people to him and to listen to him.
How do you talk about the Christian slice of the pie? And I suppose in the West especially, we're conscious of it seeming to shrink. Do you find that there are ways that, how do you handle that, Sam? I think emotionally for us as Christians, we can again be tempted towards panic, towards worry and anxiety, towards perhaps forecasts that may or may not be grounded in reality. What are the sort of things that you've had to learn to do?
Yeah, well, my kind of denominational background has been Church of England, for good or ill, a bit of both in some cases. So it's interesting, within kind of evangelical Church of England congregations, you see a huge amount of cultural Christianity. And so most of the kind of evangelistic fishing goes on within the church building, because the unbelievers bring themselves to church. But there's a lot of people who
sometimes with the vicar's costume on. So.
yes, yeah. Or even bishop. But it means there's a lot of people who think they're Christians because they're English and vaguely moral. Not as many as there used to be, and so we're seeing what seems to be a precipitous decline in that kind of grouping. And there's a lot of good things about that decline.
Yeah,
it's actually bringing clarity where previously there'd been ambiguity about what's Englishness and what's Christian, and it's all a bit muddled. Now I think we're just seeing there's a more visible difference between the church and society around us. So I see it more of a refining of the church than the actual people of God itself declining. And I think it's a necessary process for us to go through in order for the real distinctives of the gospel to be more visible. And again, another verse that is is the lens through which I look at these trends is, of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And so and the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this, from Isaiah 9. So I'm not worried about the future of the church. If the zeal of God himself is all in on growing a people for his son Jesus Christ, then that to me is a bigger headline than whether the culture likes us, whether church attendance is going up or down. I think the work of the Lord is increasing in this country, this country being England. As I see decline in those kind of mainline denominations, I mean, many of us are seeing exciting Christian initiatives, church planting and growth, not necessarily spectacular kind of headline grabbing growth, but it's clear the Lord is still at work and still drawing people to himself. And the other thing is, with a couple of friends of mine a few months ago, we read together a really old out of print book called England Before and After Wesley. It's like 300 or 400 pages. It was written in the 1920s, I think.
Wesley Breedy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I knew England was in a rough place before the Wesleyan revival, but I hadn't realized how thoroughly dark it was.
Yes.
And so every time it looks like things are getting culturally more bleak, I just think, well, okay.
Yes.
The Lord knows what he can do with that.
Yes. Yes.
And it's happened before. Let's pray that it happens again. And maybe this is the precursor for another great awakening.
I think that the importance of remembering God's ultimate sovereignty in it is it's easy to forget that, isn't it? Because we're increasingly used to reading things through the lens of sociological trends and things that we imagine we can predict. We imagine we can sort of,
or even control.
Quite, yeah.
And the trouble is, we see ourselves as as another minority group that has to lobby. And we think of ourselves increasingly in sociological terms rather than theological terms. And if Jesus says the church is his bride and he will build his church.
And so if the priorities are to be found theologically rather than sociologically, if that's the rock we're cut from, are there some priority tasks for us to give ourselves to? I suppose the obvious thing would be to say, we need to read our Bibles and pray. But as a generation, Sam, do you think there's any ways that we particularly need to watch ourselves? Do you see any particular areas where this would be a likely weakness in the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I'm sure many. I mean, we've talked a bit about the loss of cultural privilege, and that's perhaps more keenly felt in Anglican circles, where you had some of those privileges kind of exclusively in some cases. There is a danger that as we lose cultural influence, there is a temptation to be angry and resentful. And I was reading a little book recently about cultural Marxism and all this kind of stuff, and it's good to understand the trends and to feel concerned, but the book came across as just angry.
Right.
This is a threat to us. And yeah, there are ideological threats to the church, but our battle isn't against flesh and blood.
Yes. Yes.
And so whoever the primary human cultural shapers are at the moment, I don't have a beef against them. Now, there are some times when it's appropriate for Christians to stand up for some legal rights and that kind of thing. Although, again, I think it's always more seemly if we can be seen to be fighting for the rights of others rather than ourselves.
Sure.
But I think there's going to be a temptation for a lot of people either to get angry at where culture seems to be going, or to be so intimidated by the cultural forces pulling away from historic Christianity that we kind of feel we've got to just go with the flow. So I think those are the two biggest.
So being able to show genuine discernment about the way that culture is being shaped by values and idolatries that we know are wrong, and they need to be spotted and discerned, but managing at the same time to know where our hope is, and remaining confident in his sovereignty, and refusing to cheerful. So appropriate, when reviled, to not revile in return. And
exactly. And again, cultural discourse is all about scoring points and demonizing the opposition and all that kind of stuff. And we've just got to not buy into that.
Yes.
We've got to outlove our neighbours in order to love our neighbours.
Outrejoice them, as John Piper likes to say. I think
and if we cast our neighbour as our cultural enemy,
yes,
we're going to find it very hard to reach them and to love them.
Quite, yeah. People don't get converted by their enemies very often.
No, they get subdued by them.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so
I was with my kids this morning. We're going through the Book of Acts and at breakfast time, and we've got to Stephen's martyrdom, and I was struck as I was looking at it with them. Just there's no trace of Stephen showing any anger. There's firmness, there's clarity, there's even a certain condemnation in the best sense. He's confronting them, but there's no sense of fear or even anxiety. His face shone. Yeah. And he sees Jesus, and this is what makes him even more angry. But there's no anger in Stephen whatsoever. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. And at that moment, he's looking at Christ.
Yeah.
And the more we look at Jesus, the more we will look like Jesus.
It's brilliant, Sam. I'd love to just move into specifically one of the areas where we hit friction. In terms of what the story, the dream, the vision that we're presenting to the world, and the vision that the world around us seems to chase, and just in the whole area of sexuality and identity. I just a few years back, with the Me Too movement beginning to get traction, it was interesting to notice how, particularly the area of sexual abuse of all kinds, has a particular kind of stigma, a particular kind of seriousness attached to it. And that's revealing in a culture which has, in other respects, tended to try and flatten its sacredness, if you like. And I just wonder if you've got any comments on that whole area. I know it's something you've given thought to.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I follow your observation well. We've been told on the one hand for many years sex is just physical. We're just animals like anybody else. Let's not make more of a bigger deal of this than we should. But one of the things the Me Too movement has rightly identified is that sexual assault and sexual abuse is more than a physical category. There's something psychological, emotional, we would say spiritual going on as well. And therefore the damage and the wounds are far deeper than if it was a merely physical kind of abuse. And that's we're recognizing that now. We're seeing that the effects and the depth of harm that comes through abuse can be lifelong and debilitating. And so it gives the lie to the whole idea that it's just a physical thing, it's just a bodily transaction, you're just exchanging fluids, stop making a fuss over it. If the abuse of it harms us so profoundly, it surely is an indication that in its right context, it's meant to bless us so profoundly. That it's meant to be something that engages the whole of who you are.
Yes,
the whole interior. And as Christians, we understand why, because it's almost like a sacrament. It's a physical expression of a deeper covenant reality that is going on. And so because God's purpose for sexuality is so profound, the abuse of it is going to be equally so profoundly damaging to us. So I think the cultural awareness of these things is is a place where we can, we can affirm what culture is saying in this regard, and be grateful for that awareness and for those aspects of the Me Too movement. And I think gives us an on-ramp to bring some of our Christian insights to bear on this kind of discussion.
And one of the insights that we would have would also, I suppose, it's increasingly pertinent while there's so much identity confusion at the same time. So awareness of the perhaps mysterious, unique significance of sexual identity or sexual harassment, right through to all manner of negative experience. At the same time, we live in an age where people's identity it seems so hard to pin down. We've moved away from actually accepting the givenness of our identity. And I know this would be something that you've talked about many times. One of the things I've heard you especially raise is the way that for a Christian, our identity is not just given in terms of our created body, but also significantly in terms of who we are in Christ, who we've become in Christ. And that having come to know him, having received him, this redefines us altogether again. And I'd love to hear you say some things about that, Sam. Just there's such an important theme there that you've helped me with.
Yeah, it's one of the great beauties of Jesus Christ. I still don't know how he pulls this off. I just know that he does. But in Buddhist thinking, when you die, you get merged into the universal, whatever it is, thing. In a lot of Eastern thought, I think sometimes we can make identity in Christ something like that. Right. And we think once everyone becomes a Christian, they get redefined into this kind of bland, in Christness, where we lose our individuality and we lose.
We do get guitars with rainbow straps.
Yeah, our breath gets a bit bad, and things go wrong. One of the most beautiful things we see is when we come to Christ, we get our humanity back.
Brilliant. Yes.
He humanizes us. How could he not? He is the image of God. And so the way I often think of it is, God came up with the idea of you. He didn't just make you physically. He actually came up with the idea of the person that is Joel. And he was having a good day when he came up with that idea.
My wife would have questions about that, but no.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Well, that's because you don't do a naturally very good job of being Joel. The idea God.
This is why you need to speak. This is good.
I want to hear some amens on that.
Yeah, no shortage in my house, I tell you.
And in our, even many people who aren't Christians will have in their more reflective moments a sense that they're not who they feel like they should be. We're sane when we have that kind of awareness. And so what happens when we come to Christ is this beautiful paradox where Jesus tells us to deny self, to contradict some of the sort of deepest yearnings and longings of our hearts, to whatever identity we've been constructing and finessing over the years, to kind of give that over to him. And what we find in the process of following Jesus is that we become more who we were meant to be. And so we actually become our true selves. And this is the amazing thing. You could have 10 very different Christians, and over the course of a decade, they become more like Jesus Christ, but they don't become more like each other. It's not like those distinctive things gradually get ironed out into some kind of Borg-like assimilation. We actually become the very people God thought up in the first place. And so, which, Jesus is talking about, if you've got to lose your life to gain it, you've got to hand over yourself to actually find and receive yourself. And so, again, I think we've got something compelling to say to a culture that is very conscious of identity and wanting to be authentic. And you do you, and you've got to be true to yourself. That's our creed today. And I want to say that the only way you can be true to your real self is to come to Christ.
Yes.
Because the new self you receive from him is more you than the self you deny in the process of following him. Which takes some unpacking and is contradictory, and we have to scratch our heads and wonder at it, but it's nevertheless the case.
And it's demonstrated. It's not just a kind of fortune cookie slogan. We see it in the cross and resurrection, don't we? It's been done. It's been done for us and shown. So that which was planted in the natural is raised. So there's a wonderful paradigm that we can operate with. We don't have to think, what on earth does that mean? We can start to say, oh, it's living like Jesus, dying in Jesus, rising. So it becomes a very concrete thing.
Yeah.
It sounds like we need to reclaim humanism, Sam. I
think we do. I mean, we should be the most humanist people on earth because we follow the man, Jesus Christ. Yes. He is the true human. Yes. And he's making us more like himself and therefore more human in the process.
There can't be an alternative humanism if the best basis being offered is a random world with these kind of accidental bipeds that don't have any meaning.
No, and if there is a human being sat at the right hand of the Father who's going to rule the universe for eternity,
yes,
let's get in on that.
That's right. Yeah.
And secular humanism is actually contradictory.
Yeah.
Because what in a secular worldview gives you a basis on which to have faith in humanity?
Yes. Yes.
So again, I think we've got some things to say to people on that.
So when it comes to the person for whom sexuality is the major reason why following Jesus is a no-no, because I can't dream of surrendering my identity, my sexual identity, and whatever means that might be, whether it's lesbian, bisexual, gay, whether it's trans, the multiple ways in which we identify ourselves. This isn't, as you said earlier, it's not just about behaving in a different way. It's about my very self. How do we help our friends for whom that's such a huge stumbling block and an understandable one, if we sympathize?
We do, and that's the key thing. We've got to understand it. We're not going to reach people we don't understand. Yes. Proverbs 18, I think it's 18:13 says, "To give an answer before you hear is your folly and shame." Wow. And I think it's the most underutilized verse in evangelism and probably in pastoral care as well. Yeah. And we're people of the word. We're people who have something to proclaim. So our instinct rightly is to feel like we've got to be saying stuff. But we need to really understand how people are thinking the way they're thinking, why that's natural for them to think that way. So I want that person, that friend, to know that I can really get why they would see becoming a Christian as an existential threat. So I think that understanding itself is a significant part of our witness and evangelism. If we can articulate to them what they're thinking in a way that they go, yes, that's it. They will feel understood and seen and heard and hopefully appreciated. And as a human being made in the image of God, they're worthy of that depth of understanding and being seen and heard. But I think, and it'll be over time thing. There's not a mic drop way into this kind of. Yeah,
that's a helpful point to make. Yeah, we often look for the mic drop, don't we?
We don't lead people to Christ through mic drops. We lead them through walking through life with them faithfully and unspectacularly. So I think what I would want someone to know, and it will take time, it may take years, is that the reason Christianity feels like such an appalling existential threat is because they see their primary sense of who they are through their sexual identity. Understandably, it's such a deeply personal aspect of our lives, and it's what culture is incessantly training us to do. But I'd want them to know that there's just so much more to them than that. I'm not saying that's a matter of indifference. I have this with a very dear friend of mine at the moment who is wrestling with these very things. He's at a crossroads where he's just come to terms with his sexual identity. It is something he has going for him in the world's eyes. It's a strength, and he's kind of now weighing up, well, what does this mean for faith in Christ? Which way am I going to go here? And one of the things I'm trying not just to tell him, but I hope in the way I relate to him to show him as well, is there are so many kinds of awesomeness to who he is as a human being that are actually nothing to do with his sexuality. And I think we need to, as evangelicals, recover our doctrine of creation in evangelism.
Yes.
I think sometimes we start our evangelism functionally as if the Bible begins in Genesis 3.
Yeah.
And so our kind of opening salvo is, you're a sinner. And maybe that was the right approach. I just reread John Stott's Basic Christianity to kind of do how does that work for today? And I think in a moralistic, culturally Christian setting, that was the right approach. But we're not here to convince moralists that they're sinners. We're here to show anxious people that they are worth something in God's sight. And therefore, that is what makes sin so tragic, is that we've all been made to be royalty, and that potential royalty is evident in every human being. And so I want this dear friend of mine to know that I get such a kick out of knowing him because of who he is as a person. And obviously there's an element to which his sexuality is part of that, but it's not the kind of center of it. And it doesn't have the load-bearing capacity to carry the deepest significance of who he is as an image-bearing human being. And it will diminish him to put that at the center. Yes.
It's the way that we've gone culturally is to be so affected by the prevailing myth, really, that our identity, our sexuality is right at the grassroots, right at the heart of our identity. For all kinds of reasons, we've gone that way, and so I suppose helping people away from that is, as you say, is to do with presenting a different understanding, or rejoicing, celebrating all the range of ways that God has made us who we are.
And to put sexuality, to give that the star billing, it's just too small.
It's so helpful, Sam. I think the journey that we take, if in the case of the person that has that revelation and sees the joy and the worthwhileness, the pearl of great price that's worth giving up everything else for, because in your joy you've seen so much in him. The challenge many will walk out there is going to be a different shaped life than many of the Christians they see around them. I'm married with hundreds of kids, and so was my dad. Just it's the way to be a Christian in my experience of life so far is the nuclear family and so on. We're learning all the time that's we've got to show such a wisdom and kindness in building genuine family for those for whom that's not going to be their life, their calling. Help us with that, Sam. I know there's something also you've worked on.
It's it's one of the ways the church can be so uniquely beautiful. There's so many areas in our culture where people find a sense of belonging.
Yes.
And the church should outshine all of that.
Yeah.
And so my dream for churches is, and this is based on Mark 10:28 to 30:31, where Jesus talks about, if you leave behind fathers and mothers and sisters and kids, you will receive 100-fold in this age, and in the age to come, eternal life. So Jesus is saying no one should be relationally losing out by following him. And so for those for whom following Jesus will mean saying no to certain forms of intimacy and certain forms of community, they should be able to say, if the church is doing its job rightly, that because of their Christian faith and being part of the people of God, they should be able to say, do you know what? I have more intimacy in my life now than I ever had before. More community, more family. I was talking to a couple where I am here at my church, and saw a former couple, the two ladies who had been in a lesbian partnership, I think for about 15 years, both came to faith, wonderfully converted, have a couple of daughters in tow as well, just some sweet people. They've been walking with the Lord now, I think, for about 18 months. And I was catching up with them both and asking them how they were doing. And, you know, and it was really sweet. They said, we feel closer now as sisters in Christ than we ever did as lovers.
Wow. Wow.
And I thought, that feels so right, because the gospel isn't inviting us into less love.
Yeah.
If God is love, then walking in his ways will be the gateway into better love.
Yes.
It may be a different type of love, but it will be a richer love than whatever we were getting ourselves into before.
Yes, yes.
And not, you know, it won't be the case that every former couple become, you know, great friends in Christ. But it should be the case that we have more love in our lives than we ever could have had beforehand.
I suppose it's the similar outworking of that principle of, if I learn to put Jesus before my marriage, if I learn to love Jesus more than I love my wife, I end up loving my wife more anyway.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and I think it's Lewis I got that insight from originally.
Yeah.
But it's, if you love God first and wife or whatever it is second, you will end up loving your wife more than if you love them first. And that you can switch anything out into that: country, job, family, friends. We love everything better when we love God first.
But what an important thing to hold strong and firm and reach out with at a time when following Jesus will involve what, at least for moments, will feel like rupture of those relationships and pain, and to have nothing to hope for is too much, surely, for us. But to be able to say, no, I know that this God, as you've said, he is love. He's Father, Son, Spirit. If he wasn't, where would we go with all of that pain? But to a God who knows better than anyone how to build real relationship.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we've got to, as churches, really put our money where our mouth is on that.
Yes.
And make sure that we are making that kind of love visible.
Are there any, I know you've written a book on this, Sam, so it's unfair to say give us your best on that. But maybe the best is to just go and buy Sam's book. But what are some classic things to avoid? Just as that's one way of putting it. Just that we tend to fall into typically as Christians in this day and age, those things that make it so much harder for the single person to connect meaningfully with church community. Yeah,
I apart from the last year or so, I've lived my entire life in Southern England, and the kind of cultural norm in much of Southern England is that the nuclear family is meant to be entirely self-contained and self-sufficient, and we transfer that mentality into church life as well. And so sometimes we can do church in such a way that it feels like the basic unit of church life is a nuclear family. And therefore, when I often speak at churches, one of the questions I get is, how can we help the single people fit into the church family? And the very framing of the question is already presuming they're not because they're single. So we need to make sure that we are making our church life not structured around families and then we'll try and fit in some singles too, but actually that we're basing our church life around people, all of whom need the input and the relationships with the wider church family. Families really need that.
Yes.
Married couples really need friends.
Yes.
So it's not just we've got to do this for the singles, we've got to do this for everyone.
Yes.
So I think that's a key thing. I will always remember chatting with a family I really close to and know really well, and they were going into a crazy couple of weeks, and I said to them, listen, do you want me to take your kids to school this week? And they said, oh, we can't ask you to do that. And I said, you didn't. I've offered to do it. And, you know, if it's one less thing for you, I said, it'd be kind of fun for me. I don't normally do anything like that. So I'd be really happy to do that.
But how did that week go, Sam? Were you enjoying it by Friday?
Well, and this is the thing. They said, no, we just can't let you do that. And maybe, maybe they just didn't like my driving or something. But it's interesting. There's something deep within a lot of families would feel as though that must mean we failed if you need to come in and do that for us. And the fact is, all of us need the rest of us.
Yes.
And that's not just for an hour and a bit on a Sunday morning. That is in life generally. We need the people of God. We don't cease to be part of the body when we're outside the church building.
Yeah.
And I'm a single person. Goodness me, I need the input of lots of other people in my life. And I think we assume that with singles, and particularly with single men, people will assume certain things that I'll be completely incapable of doing, fairly or otherwise. But I think we sort of assume, well, families, because they're a family, they must have everything together. And they're not designed to. So let's all be unembarrassed about leaning into and on one another. And for our family life to work healthily, we couldn't imagine doing that without so-and-so and thingy and the other guy who always comes in and helps. And those of us who are single, we wouldn't function healthily were it not for the fact that we know that house is always open to us. And it's just such a glorious win-win when that happens. And it's part of how we find intimacy. It's often in those kind of dumb everyday things, the cumulative effect is that really gives you a sense of being known and of doing life with others, far more than the kind of, going out and doing something spectacular would.
So the little and often, again, it's the temptation to the mic drop, isn't it? The kind of, I've solved that problem with my wonderful moment of ministry.
So I often say to families, in terms of hospitality, it's actually being made less fuss of that makes me feel more at home.
Yes.
Because when someone makes a big fuss over you, they're not letting you into their normal life. They're letting you into their tidied up Instagram version of life.
Make yourself at home, but for goodness sake, don't make yourself at home.
Make yourself at home, and we kind of wish you were. And I remember going around to a family's house once, and they were in the middle of a just World War III level argument. And I
can't imagine. I don't know quite what you mean. I've never been.
And some families do that, Joel. It's
I weep for them.
And the thing was, they didn't stop or even pause when I arrived. Like, hey, Sam, and then they were straight back into it. And they were kind of apologetic afterwards. I was like, actually, counterintuitively, that made me feel a little bit more at home. You weren't suspending actual life for the visitor. You were inviting the visitor into actual life in its ugly side as well as its glorious side. You were actually disclosing something of who you really are to me.
Yes.
And that relationally takes us to a deeper place. And if you'd kind of pretended to be, the Waltons for a couple of hours while I was around.
More like the Simpsons in my case, but
Yeah, both of which are very, very outdated and, no one Forty knows what we're talking about right
I
now.
used us both there. I thought I was being hip, but I would, if it was like the 1990s, it might have been. Never mind. You can always try.
To me, it isn't.
Don't know what the equivalent is now, but I think the challenge is felt perhaps most acutely for the single person that I imagine maybe at times maybe goes through phases of feeling this is so hard. The church just doesn't get me, even when they try to, even when they pretend to. It kind of makes it worse, you know. How would you speak to that person, Sam? Is there a word of counsel?
Yeah, it's normal to go through those seasons.
Yeah.
So don't feel this must mean the wheels have fallen off and everything's gone wrong with your Christianity.
Yes.
There are going to be times like that, even in great churches. And part of the reason for that is because in a fallen, broken world like ours, everyone is going to have times when they're not properly understood and factored into and everything else. We can't properly honor each other. So it would be entirely expected in a fallen world to have times where it feels like no one's really noticing me or getting me. And it's right to feel the pain of that because we're meant to be seen and valued and known and loved. And it's not unique to singles. There will be ways in which it's occasioned by singleness. Often it might be the physical sense of not being with others. But I've been in pastoral ministry long enough to know that married people go through the same feeling.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Not necessarily as a couple, but as individuals within a marriage, it is very easy to feel this person, I don't even know if they understand me.
Yes.
And I know people who have had seasons of profound loneliness in their own marriage.
Yes.
And of not feeling seen and properly understood. And as a single person, I imagine that must be more painful.
Yes.
And there's the pain of feeling that you're not understood because you don't have people around you. But I imagine it's more painful to feel not understood when you do have people around you.
Yes, yes.
So
It's such a powerful point. It's interesting how I think so many of our kind of relational pathologies, you know, the problems we have trying to build good friendships and relationships in the church, the trouble that we have on all kinds of levels, generationally, ethnically, class. We're very aware of those kind of seismic differences. The sensitivities they create can make us assume sort of that we're especially struggling in a way that I remember New Day, which is our huge youth conference that we had the privilege of working with for many years. I've had people come to me and say sometimes, I don't feel like I'm connecting with the team. I don't feel like I belong. I don't feel like anyone's noticing me. And I'm working so hard to make this event happen. I'm serving so hard. And I've tried to be gracious and gentle, but in my own mind, I thought, actually, I'm leading this thing. And I sometimes feel like that.
Yeah.
It's important, I guess, to remember the point you're making, that there are pains that we actually share more than we realize.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, everyone can feel that way and assume they're the only one.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's one of the, is it Hagar in Genesis who suddenly comes to that realization that she's been seen by the Lord? Maybe someone else, I can't quite remember.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
It's one of the comforts in those seasons of feeling humanly unseen.
Yes.
Is that we are fully seen by our God. And that's a comfort.
Yes.
There's nothing we're going through he doesn't understand.
Yes. Yes.
And, you know,
he knows my path.
He does. And, you know, in Hebrews tells us we have a high priest who's not unable to sympathize. He's not a stranger to the kinds of things we go through.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so important, isn't it? Yeah. Sam, we've gone over time by a long way, which is not surprising to me, because I know what I'm like. But I'm nevertheless, I'd love to just ask one more question, and just, well, I've got two more. One of them's practical, but just, they're both practical, you understand. I might rephrase that. I have a couple more questions. I think one of them is, just tell us, Sam, again, maybe you've touched on this already, but why do you love Jesus? How can you try and summarize that if you have to?
I love Jesus because he loved me first. And I don't mean I will only love anyone who has already loved me, but there's something about the love of Jesus for us that invites us into love for him. No one loves us like he does.
Yeah.
So I used to think the Apostle John was a bit obnoxious when in his gospel he kept referring to the disciple who Jesus loved. I thought that kind of conceited. And then I realized, and this is significant for our cultural moment, because we define ourselves by who we love. When you're loved by Jesus, you become defined by who loves you.
Yes.
And John is now the disciple that Jesus loves.
Yes.
And there's a beauty to Jesus that we see nowhere else. Glenn Scrivener, I'm sure, is a mutual friend, and he will often say to atheists or agnostics, if there was to be a God who existed, wouldn't you want him to be exactly like Jesus Christ?
Mm.
And I love just rereading the Gospels and seeing Jesus in action, seeing his compassion, seeing his boldness, seeing his insight, and just there's beauty there.
Mm. Mm.
So that's why I love Jesus.
Superb. Fantastic. That's so rich. Sam, where can we go to get more of what you have to say? Tell us a little bit about how to connect with you online, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I do have a website that I set up a few years ago and then did nothing with. So if you want a time capsule of what I was up to in 2016, then that would be the place to look. A lot of my writing
on Brexit and I don't know. Sorry, I'll shut up. I'll carry on.
Looking forward to this new musical called Hamilton that's coming out sometime. A lot of what I write ends up on the Gospel Coalition or Desiring God, and books I've written are on Amazon somewhere in a bargain bin probably. And the main social media I tend to use is Twitter, so that's probably the easiest way of finding me online.
You managed to engage on Twitter and I know from having watched that you are a gracious Twitter presence, it's good that you're there.
Unless you're a friend of mine, in which case I just want to give you a hard time. There's such a lovely pleasure in being a jerk to your friends online. I'm deeply disappointed that you've only been nice so far. So I clearly not enough of a friend. I'll have to pray for better days. I will unleash on you.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Sam. It's just been a joy, as I expected it would be, and we're really privileged to have had so much of your time. Thank you. I'm honoured to be with you. Thank you for having me. Bless you. Okay, well, we'll have to say over and out, and God bless you, and speak to you hopefully again soon. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed that as much as I did. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to connect with such a good man, such a good example, and so much wisdom. We look forward to doing our next one of these in February. We will have more to tell you very soon about the time, the date, and the people that we will be interviewing. This has been a really fun adventure for us over these last months doing these, and we'll continue to roll these out, God willing, and sharing a lot with you. So bless you, thank you for joining us, and see you soon.